We've seen examples of functions before, so let's talk about what they actually are. Functions are essentially reusable recipes. Examples we've seen are the print function, which printed out some text, the C function, which combined a series of values into a vector, and the RUnif function, which generated some random numbers. In all cases, they took some inputs and they returned an output. Kind of like how a recipe for food takes a variety of different ingredients and returns an output at the end. To use a function in R, we always write its name immediately followed by brackets. We can't put a space between the function name and the brackets. Formally, we would say that we are calling the function when we run it like this. And we can supply whatever arguments we want to inside the brackets of the function when we call it. The inputs to a function are called its arguments. And arguments to a function, if you have more than one of them, have to be separated by commas. Each time that we call a function, we can pass in different arguments, different inputs, and when we do that, we will get different outputs, or we might get different outputs. So here, for example, are two examples of using the C function with different inputs, and we get a different vector each time. So calling a function is an expression in R, in the same way that adding two numbers together, like 2 plus 2, was also an expression. And we can combine expressions into bigger expressions. So for example, instead of doing 2 plus 2, we could say 2 plus a vector, right? The function C creates the vector. This is an expression in and of itself, and then we embed it essentially into this larger expression of 2 plus the vector, right? In which case 2 gets added to each of these numbers, giving us a new vector of 3 numbers as the output. We can also assign the output of functions to variables, right? Here we're creating the same vector with a C function, but we're assigning it to X, and just like with assignment as we saw before, nothing will get returned from that line of code, right? Nothing will be printed out below it. So if we want to see now what is stored in our new variable X, we have to put X by itself on its own line to return its contents. Now the list of arguments that a function can accept, along with the name of the function, is called a function's signature. It's called a signature because it essentially has to be unique. It has to be different from any other function and argument combination. So it's helpful to look up function signatures because they tell you what arguments that function can accept. They also tell you the names of those arguments and whether the arguments have default values. When we used the RUnif function before, we only supplied one argument, which was the number of random numbers that we wanted to generate. And if we look at the function signature here, we see that the first argument is called n, and if you were to look at the information about this function, it would tell you that n is the argument that will determine how many random numbers this function creates and returns. We also see there are two other possible arguments we can supply, and these are written a little bit differently, right? We have min equals 0. that means that there is an argument called min. It's the second argument to the function. But the fact that it says equals 0 means that it has a default value, 0. And similarly here, max has a default value. These control the upper and lower bounds of the random numbers that we're going to generate. So the default is to generate numbers between 0 and 1. We don't have to supply arguments to arguments that have a default. Right? We don't have to supply an argument to min or an argument to max. If we don't, then it will just use the defaults. If you want to look up the signature of a function, you can do so on its help page, and the easiest way to do that is to type question mark and the name of the function into the RStudio console and hit enter. So for example, if you were to type question mark RUnif into the console and hit enter, RStudio would show you the help page for that function, and it would show you this function signature along with descriptions of what each of these arguments does. So when arguments have names, we can supply the name of the argument, right? We can say n equals 5 to specify that we want 5 random numbers generated. But we don't have to put the n equals or the argument name equals as long as we supply the values to each of those arguments in order, right? So because n is the first argument of RUnif, we can leave it off here in this second example, and R then assumes, okay, this first argument 5, it's going to pass it to the n argument, right? But we know the second argument was actually min. So if we want to specify only the max and leave the min as the default value, we have to say max equals 10. We couldn't just put 10 because then R would assume that 10 is the argument you want to pass to min instead. Okay, so if we're passing values to arguments out of the order specified in the function signature, then we need to start using the names for those. Otherwise, you can leave the argument names out.